Good evening. Hello.
Hello.
Firstly, I'd just like to say that there's a slight change to the plan for this evening. I was expecting to be co-presenting with Serge Perignon, who is the global head of marketing for Tata Consultancy Services, which is India's biggest company by market capitalisation. And he and I have spent quite a lot of time preparing this presentation. And then I got a call from him this morning. He's in Fort Lauderdale and was unable to get a flight that would get him into New York in time for this evening's presentation.
It was probably United.
Well, I arrived in Mumbai yesterday after 17 hours as a guest of United. You'll see that there's no physical damage to me. So I was quite pleased about that. Long but relatively uneventful flight. So I want to just make 2 points about the fact that Serge is not here. First of all, which is to say it's not just in far-flung parts of the world that things can go wrong, it can happen in America. So having a plan B is always important. Plan B for me has involved spending the first half of today making some tweaks to this presentation. Secondly, Serge has a broader experience than I do in terms of emerging markets. I have a fairly deep knowledge of India, as you will see from the presentation. He has had some experience in other markets, including in Latin America. So the part where we were hoping to draw some comparisons, if you will, between those various different markets is the piece which has kind of dropped out of the presentation. So I apologise for that, but I hope you'll be not too disappointed to spend the next probably about 50 minutes listening to me and looking at some nice pictures. So let's begin. Firstly, I would like to transport you to Mumbai, India's commercial capital. Come in. Those of you that thought the A train was something of a struggle this morning may well prefer not to experience Mumbai's local trains. This is the scene at Churchgate Station, which is one of the city's main termini. An estimated 8 million people use Mumbai's local trains every day. That's approximately half of the, or almost half of the city's official population of 18 million. In reality, Mumbai has a population in excess of 20 million people. It's a busy place and getting more so. The population of Mumbai has more than doubled in the last 25 years. Every month, tens of thousands of people flood into the city in search of jobs, opportunity, and a better life. Better, of course, is something of a relative concept. By 2020, it's predicted that Mumbai will be the most populous place on the planet. More than 60% of Mumbai's population live in unofficial settlements or slums. This is the view as you arrive at the city's international airport. Meanwhile, it is also the location of the world's most expensive personal residence. It's a building called Antilla. It's a 27-story, billion-dollar home of India's richest man, a guy called Mukesh Ambani, who owns a group of businesses called Reliance. As you can see, it's a city of contrasts and extremes. Opulence and poverty sit side by side. And as such, it's typical of many of the megacities that are the powerhouses of economic growth in emerging markets. So there are 3 parts to my presentation today. Firstly, we'll look at why emerging markets are important. Secondly, I'm going to take something of a deep dive into India. It's my view that it's an archetype for emerging markets and that what prevails in India is also present in many other fast growth markets. And third, we'll look at some of the skill sets needed to succeed. What does it take to succeed professionally in these exciting but at the same time challenging places? I'd like to set the scene and ask if anybody knows what the circle represents. I don't know if any of you have seen this illustration, but I'll take answers if anybody can tell me. What do you think the circle represents? Southeast Asia? Yeah, it has South and East and Southeast Asia. It's something which is more than just a geographic location. Somebody else?
About 30% of the world's population.
30% of the population, no. More people live inside the circle than live outside of it. Yeah? And you'll notice that actually a lot of the circle has sea in it. Yeah? So you can get a sense of how densely populated that part of the world is. Yeah? More people live inside that circle than live outside of the circle. Inside the circle are many of what's known as emerging markets. I think emerging markets are a big story, possibly the biggest story of the 21st century. McKinsey & Co., the consultants, predicts that by 2025, consumption in emerging markets will exceed $30 trillion. They describe the rapid growth that's taking place in emerging markets as the biggest growth opportunity in the history of capitalism. So as we get underway, let's just consider what it is that we mean by emerging markets. There are several definitions, and some people think that the term itself is somewhat dated, but nobody seems to have come up with an alternative which has gained any common usage. So I'm going to use it this evening. What we can say is that all of these markets have some of the following characteristics. They are large economies with fast GDP growth. They have rapidly growing middle classes with spending power. They experience urbanization, or they are experiencing urbanization in an unprecedented scale. They are experiencing closer integration to the world economy as they become investment destinations, service providers, and part of the global supply chain. You may have heard the term BRIC, stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. I'm not going to test you to see if you know which of those, which is which. And I'm really not going to get into it when it comes to these ones. So, other emerging markets include Argentina, Mexico, Poland, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Nigeria, Pakistan, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, and Taiwan. These countries are not aligned to each other. They don't form a bloc, but they do exhibit some, what I would say, are common characteristics. They're all typically complex, in part because of their size and scale, in part because they also have relatively limited history of democracy. McKinsey also predicts that in the next 20 years, 40% of global growth will come from just 440 cities in emerging markets. And these are not the mega cities, or they're not just the mega cities of Shanghai and Beijing, Mumbai and New Delhi, Seoul, Jakarta, Manila, Karachi, all of which you'll note were in that small circle that I showed in an earlier slide. Most of the places that McKinsey identifies as its key drivers of growth are what would typically be termed Tier 2 cities. Large urban conurbations, sometimes defined by their population, typically between 3 and 15 million people living in that city, or by its GDP, defined typically as between $68 and $299 billion per annum. So these are big cities. Places in India such as Rajkot and Nagpur, Nasik, Baroda, Srinagar and Bhubaneswar, cities that you've probably never heard of and would struggle to pronounce. In China, cities such as Chengdu and Dalian, Hangzhou and Tianjin. In Indonesia, Surabaya, Bandung and Medan. Closer to home in Brazil, Salvador and Brasilia. These cities are magnets. Millions of young people are turning their backs on rural communities and moving to these fast-growing cities in search of work and prosperity. Many of these city dwellers are the emerging middle classes that so excite economists and business leaders. There's a definition used by the World Bank and other institutions that defines this group of middle-income people as people that earn between $10 and $50 a day. This rapidly urbanizing, upwardly mobile class is driving growth and demand for a host of infrastructure, products and services. There's a vast appetite for education, financial services, smartphones, cars, flat-screen TVs, designer brands, fast food, online shopping, and a range of luxury and lifestyle items such as fine wines and whiskies. You'd be interested to know that India's consumption of Scotch whisky is greater than the product of Scotland's whisky industry. So you have to beware of cheap imitations, or not necessarily cheap imitations. My opinion is that anyone aspiring to a global role in the field which I'll broadly call business communications in the 21st century needs to understand these places and the attitudes of their people. They're exciting places to live and work. Let me tell you a bit more about my background and how I ended up being here talking to you today about emerging markets. Nearly 10 years ago, as Al said in his introduction, I decided to leave London, where I was born and where I had spent the first half of my professional career. London has been, for several hundred years, one of the world's global cities, a financial powerhouse, a magnet for capital of all forms, finance, talent and ideas. Whether it can continue to hold such an exalted place, having chosen to indulge in an extraordinary act of self-harm in deciding to leave the European Union, remains to be seen. Those of you who pay attention to foreign news may have noticed that this morning the British Prime Minister called a snap election, which will be held on the 8th of June, 7th or 8th of June. Whether or not that will change the decision to depart from the world's largest trading bloc remains to be seen. I think it's unlikely. I had a successful 15 years working in the world of communications and media. I began my career as a business journalist. I moved into agency life. I proved to be reasonably adept at managing and growing large accounts. I managed an agency, as Al said, with offices in Europe and the Middle East and here in New York. And I'm delighted that some of my former colleagues are here today. It's lovely to see you. I'm even more happy to see what it is that you've been able to go on and achieve in the intervening years. As the first decade of the 21st century unfolded, I became convinced that the second half of my professional career would be spent elsewhere. I sat in this office, dreaming of places like this. Several factors converge to form that opinion. I saw a trend in which the balance of economic power shifted towards the east. I began seeing takeovers of companies which had traditionally been British or European firms by companies from far-flung parts of the world. One of our clients was a company called Chorus. It's a steel-making business that had earlier been called British Steel, and once it was a mainstay of the UK stock market. In 2007, it was acquired by Tata Steel, an Indian company. Some of my colleagues thought that the world had gone mad. How could such a traditional British business, steeped in history, be owned by Indians? After all, haven't we once owned India? One of my observations, having seen that transaction firsthand, was that from a professional perspective, the communications part of it could have been handled differently. I'll return to that point a little bit later, but it planted for me the seed of an idea. The next year, another iconic British brand, Jaguar Land Rover, was bought by another part of the Tata Group, Tata Motors. Now, Jaguar Land Rover had previously had foreign owners, both German, BMW, and American, Ford. Now, we Brits could cope with that because these were both, companies from the developed world. This was entirely okay for, a British brand to be owned by companies from the industrialized, developed world. But suddenly, they had owners from parts of the other world that were considered underdeveloped, places described as third world countries, which had, since the end of the Second World War, been considered peripheral to the world economy. So while my colleagues and I agreed that the world was indeed going mad and had indeed been turned upside down, we responded in different ways. My response was to embrace that shift in power and to bet on emerging markets. So two ideas germinated. The first was that if I assumed there was to be more such activity at the places, the intersection between developed and emerging markets, I thought that there was potentially a business opportunity. For me, that involved the idea of providing communication support to the companies involved in that kind of cross-border activity. And it looked to me as though there wasn't anybody else really working in that niche. As we'll go on to see, niches in emerging markets can be quite big, because of the sheer scale and size of the opportunity. Secondly, having run businesses in the US and Europe, I knew about the costs of employing people, of employing teams of designers or copywriters or producers or project managers in those places. And I thought, if you could get the balance of cost and quality right, there was a business to be done by providing those resources from India. So for the past 8.5 years, I've been involved in exploring both of those opportunities and now co-own 2 businesses that do those 2 things. Just to add a personal dimension, my wife, as Al mentioned, is a woman of Indian origin. She was born in Uganda, East Africa, moved to England as a child. She'd grown up there. She had spent time visiting India, but she had never lived there. And we have 2 half-Indian children. So, in the days of the British Empire, Englishmen, or Britishers as they were known, would typically have sent their children back to England to have their education. We decided we would do it the other way around, and so we took our children from England and took them to India, which is where they are being educated. I wanted them to be comfortable living in India, which will certainly be one of the world's most important markets during their lives. I now have a 9-year-old daughter. Roberta has met her. She thinks I have done her some terrible injustice, having moved her from London and made her go and live in this terrible, horrible, dirty place. There's far too many people there. I hope that at some point, after she's come and studied here at FIT at some point in the future, she will look back and reflect on that and realise that we did a good thing in terms of opening up those opportunities. Not the kind of things that 9-year-olds really appreciate. So we rented out our house in North London and moved to Mumbai. We swapped this kind of transport for this. And we became migrants. And I use that term migrant deliberately. I am an economic migrant. I moved to India to set up a business. And I have a strong belief that migrants in general contribute significantly to their host economies. We create jobs, in my case, highly skilled and well-paid ones. We impart knowledge and skills. We pay plenty of taxes. And of course, migrant has become a highly charged word in the political arena, and I do my bit every day to try and reclaim the word with all its positive value-creating connotations. And at this point, I would have handed over to Serge, who's a Frenchman who lives in India, who shares that kind of view, which is about not being an expatriate and being an immigrant or a migrant into a country. I was also going to make a joke at his expense about the fact that of all the third world countries I've been to, I think in many ways France is the most beautiful.
We have a Frenchman in the back there.
Bonjour.
Jean-Marc.
You do not leave that room, you know.
So, part 2. Let me tell you a bit about India and what it is like to live there and do business. India is home to 1.3 billion people. That's 18% of the world's population. More than 1 in 6 people on the planet lives in India, and sometimes it feels like they're all in front of us trying to get to exactly the same place, but at a much slower pace than I want to get there. The population grew by a breathtaking 180 million people between 2001 and 2011. Right, that's the equivalent of adding 20 cities the size of New York in a decade, yeah, or the equivalent of about 90% of Brazil's current population in 10 years. The scale gives you a sense of both the opportunity and the challenge that India presents. It's a young country. 65% of Indians are under 35. 365 million Indians are aged between 16 and 24. So unlike many developed nations with aging populations and pensions crises to contend with, India has what's described as a demographic dividend, a bulge in the number of young people entering the workforce. I shared this data point with Rob earlier on, and he didn't, I think, quite believe me. 1 million people join the workforce in India every month. 1 million new people every month. 12 million people every year who need jobs. It's a massive number. These are India's millennials, a generation that has had unprecedented opportunities in a nation that's experienced rapid, albeit uneven, economic growth. Just give me a moment. Bit of water, by the way, Al. Thank you.
It's Italian.
I won't say anything rude about Italy being a third world country. Let me tell you about.
Well,
India.
you should.
Let me tell you about India's millennials. They have much in common with their peers in other parts of the world. They spend their time moving around in cars that they booked on Uber, to hook up with people that they met on Tinder, to Netflix and chill. And when they're done with that, they order food via a collection and delivery service and pay for it with a mobile-enabled payment wallet. The platforms may vary from one place to the other, but similar stories are being played out in New York and London, Nairobi and Jakarta, and Mumbai too. But in some ways, Indians, millennials, are unique. Whereas countries in the West experience an ongoing series of cultural, social and political revolutions throughout the 20th century, India has essentially experienced two moments of transformation in the past century. The first was in 1947, when the country became independent. For those without a good grasp of world history, it had been part of the British Empire for some 250 years. These two men were the leaders of the freedom struggle. On the left you have Jawaharlal Nehru, who became the nation's first Prime Minister, and on the right, Mahatma Gandhi, known as the father of the nation. Sadly, the 5 decades after independence were characterised in India by low economic growth, austerity and scarcity. These blighted the lives of generations of Indians whose life options were limited, and not surprisingly, many of them chose to migrate. The second is an era which began in 1991 with the liberalisation of the Indian economy. It began or ushered in an era of rapid economic growth and relative prosperity. New employment opportunities opened up as the economy grew. Many people have made the journey from rural to urban India. So in the West, where you have this sort of incremental changes between generations which occurred between or in the decades after World War II, the gap between generations was not so dramatic. It may have felt dramatic to you and your parents or you and your offspring, but in absolute terms, it was not. In India, the generation now entering the workforce and becoming voters and consumers has vastly different expectations from those of their parents. My contention is that the delta of change which is taking place in India is unprecedented. Again, it makes it a very interesting time to live and work in India. Let me just kind of give you a couple of other scene setters to give you a sense of the scale and the challenges. India is now home to 1 billion mobile phone subscribers and has more than 300 million smartphones. That means that for many Indians, their experience of the internet comes via a mobile device. And of course, there's much excitement and plenty of private equity and institutional money focused on the digital opportunity in India. India produces more movies than the US. Bollywood is used as sort of shorthand for all Indian movies. In actual fact, it only refers to the Hindi language segment of that market or that industry, which, as you can see, is then actually massively outnumbered by the number of movies that are produced in other local languages. Bollywood is located in Mumbai, which is also the home to the banking industry, interestingly. In the US, those two industries are separated by a whole continent. In India, the money and the movies live side by side, so there's always a good party if you happen to know the right people. I made my Bollywood debut a couple of years ago, that's me, in the role of the Viceroy, Lord Victor Bruce, in a movie called Hawai. It was a critical and commercial flop. But it was quite a fun thing to do. A final point about India that's worth noting is that for all this excitement, it is not an easy place to do business. The World Bank ranks countries on their relative ease of doing business. India ranks 130th out of 190 countries. Does anyone know where the US ranks?
120.
Anyone hazard a guess?
189.
140.
No, it's very much in the top 10. I think it's currently 8. Does anybody know where the easiest place to do business is in 2017?
German.
It's not Germany, no. Germany would be, it's not Switzerland either, no. It's kind of right at the other end of the world. It's actually New Zealand. Singapore comes second, which is one of the reasons why I recently set up a business in Singapore rather than having to go through the drama which is associated with trying to set up a business in India. 100 commenting to you. What Hofstede is really famous for is identifying 6 dimensions, and he used these to measure how societies compared or contrasted with each other. I want to quickly point out 3 of these where there's a big gap between India and the US. So the blue columns here are how the US scores, and the green columns there are how India scores. And you can see that 3 of them, the power difference one, the individualism one, and the indulgence, there's quite a significant variance. So I'm just going to talk briefly about those 3. I'm using this view from the bar at the top of the Four Seasons Hotel in Mumbai. If anybody's coming to Mumbai, I would wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a fabulous bar. I have no financial interest in it, but for me, it really kind of sums up the disparity that you get. So you've got this fabulous bar over here, great music, international DJs flown in, super cocktails, overlooking, you know, the slums and high-rise buildings of Mumbai. For me, it kind of quite neatly encapsulates the contradictions that I was describing earlier. But what I also think it does is it gives a sort of visual representation to this idea of power distance, which is defined as the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions or organisations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. Yeah? It has to do with the fact that a society's inequality is endorsed as much by the followers as it is by the leaders. And India has a very, very high power distance. It's very unequal. Yeah? It has mass poverty and obscene wealth, kind of illustrated by this photograph. But the point is that this is largely accepted by people across the spectrum to be normal and to be acceptable. And that contrasts, I think, with a general sense of things being more equal, or people striving towards a greater level of equality in the US. Individualism. The US is highly individualistic. Yeah? It means people are focused on I rather than we. You'll see that India is much more collectivist. Yeah? The well-being of others is important. And finally, indulgence. This measures the degree to which people try to control their desires and impulses. In the US, the idea of work hard, play hard allows people to indulge. In India, one is encouraged to forego. Indulgence is restrained, not condoned. And I think that it's vital to understand some of these differences because they actually have a profound bearing on how people act and behave and the frames of reference within which they see the world.
What's uncertainty avoidance?
It's the degree to which people will try to avoid not knowing what's going on. Yeah? So it's about tactics that allow you to have a greater degree of clarity. Yeah? And you know, the difference there is pretty insignificant. Yeah? So yeah. And I would, you know, encourage you to go and, you know, all of this stuff is readily available online, and I think it provides quite an interesting framework within which to start to think about the differences, the cultural differences between some of these places. One thing that makes India unique is the prevalence of Hinduism. So there are more than 1 billion people who subscribe to what's probably not a religion officially, but a sort of framework of thinking described as Hinduism. It permeates almost every aspect of life in India. This is a picture which is taken at one of the beaches in Mumbai. in the Ganpati festival, the elephant god, at the end of September. And literally what people do is they take these massive statues, which are made of all kinds of nasty chemicals, and go and put them in the sea. Because that's going to help them in their next life. And part of Hinduism is about a belief in reincarnation. It clearly doesn't do very much for the quality of the current life while you pour all these chemicals into the sea. But there's a sense in which people are comfortable with making a mess of the here and now, because what they're doing is they're setting themselves up for a better life, or a better existence in the next life. So what that leads to is a set of rather fatalistic attitudes, a willingness, as we described earlier, around power, distance, to be able to accept these vast inequalities of power and wealth. And as I said, it also includes a belief in reincarnation. What you do in this life dictates what happens to you in the next. I, on one occasion, had a fascinating conversation with a very senior HR professional who explained to me the difficulties of trying to implement a performance management system in a culture where people believe in reincarnation. Hey, if it doesn't happen in this life, it'll happen in the next one, or it might, you know. So she was struggling with trying to impose a system which was about, you know, performing over this quarter and the next quarter to these people who were just like, hey, whatever. So that concludes section 2, if you will, around my experience of living in India, or some of the sort of characteristics of it. So in this final section, let us consider why all of this might be important and what implications it has for young people embarking on careers in the world of communications, which may include some of you. My thesis is that despite the current backlash against globalization in some quarters, you may have experienced some of that over the last few months, that the reality of the working lives of people who are coming into the workforce in this decade and those to come is that many companies, many countries will want to participate in that emerging market growth that we described at the outset. More and more business will be done across borders, and the places where emerging and developed markets meet will become an important nexus. The ability to operate in those places, I think, will be a determinant of the ability to succeed. To do so will require a lot more than the technical skills of being a good writer, or being a designer, or being a competent producer. Yeah? Those, of course, will continue to be important. If you like, they're your table stake. But alongside those technical skills, I think there are a whole set of other skills and capabilities which you should be mindful of and able to master if you want to succeed in the globalized world of the 21st century. One of those, I believe, is EQ, or the measure of emotional intelligence. You may all feel that you have great EQ. There are a number of different parameters there, a level of emotional self-awareness, to be able to understand your emotions and the influence that they have on your actions and the way in which you engage with people. The ability for self-control, the ability to be able to adapt in different circumstances, to be able to moderate or change or calibrate your response to different external stimuli or scenarios. To be oriented around achievement or around outcome rather than focused on what your input has been. To have a positive outlook, the glass being half full rather than the glass being half empty. Social awareness, empathy, and ability to put yourself in the shoes of other people. We've started to talk about this in terms of describing some of the differences between, you know, North American culture and Indian culture. My belief is that to be able to succeed in those places, you need to develop that empathy and to be able to see the world through the eyes of other people. It also requires what I describe, or is described as organisational awareness. In other words, being able to see where you fit and perhaps to understand the levers that need to be or are available to you in terms of being able to navigate what are sometimes quite complex organisations. And all of that, I think, leads to an ability to manage relationships and about an ability to influence decisions, to influence colleagues, to influence stakeholders. I think it's about being able to manage conflict and to be able to identify that conflicts present themselves in different ways through different cultures. Increasingly to be able to lead people by coaching and mentoring them, to be able to participate in teamwork, to be able to deliver inspirational leadership rather than leading people through a sort of command and control structure, which has perhaps been more prevalent during the 20th century. My contention is that in these places where emerging and developed markets meet, in the 21st century, the old command and control systems won't work, and that there are a whole set of other skills that need to be learned and deployed. One of which I think is flexibility, and it's, I think, important to remember that in a global setting, we'll all approach things differently, yet that there are often more than one solution to the same challenge, and that that's an important thing to understand, to recognise that somebody else's solution may be valid, that yours is not necessarily right, theirs is not necessarily wrong. A kind of flexible approach, I think, is an important part of being able to operate in these places. Patience is indeed a virtue. In Indian organisations, I find that there are many, many gated processes where there's lots of steps to achieve a decision, and the hierarchy and bureaucracy in those organisations is very different from the sort of much flatter type of structures that we've become accustomed to in the West. So the process in North America may have many fewer steps. The process in India may be much, much more complex. And it's not just about making those processes the same, it's about understanding how to achieve the goal in scenarios where the decision-making processes are very different. So an example that I would give in the type of work that we do is around the layers or levels of approval that are required in order to get a piece of content approved. Now, in North America, obviously with the exception of FIT, where these things are very difficult and complex, in most organisations that kind of thing has been relatively streamlined. Yeah? You know, the number of people who have to approve something has been minimised, whereas in India, this thing has been maximised. Anybody who conceivably could have an interest in it sticks their oar in and wants to be part of that process. And so it means that, you know, the number of rounds or the number of iterations typically becomes very large, and the whole thing becomes very long-winded. An ability to navigate complexity, I think, is absolutely vital. The ability to manage in places where things are uncertain. Indian work culture is not very open. You know, typically you don't walk into an Indian office and find that it's an open plan space. Typically it's got lots of boxes and people are assigned their places dependent upon their length of tenure and their seniority. But you have to be okay with less information and able to make assumptions and decisions within that context. Sensitivity, I think, and a genuine interest in the places with which you are engaging and the people with which you are engaging is imperative. I think it's really important to take the time to understand historical, social, cultural backgrounds, because those have, as I said, a direct impact on the people that you're going to work with. And without that level of sensitivity, without that level of interest, most people fail. The prevalence of Hinduism, as I mentioned earlier, is a classic case. If you don't need to understand the full universe of Hindu gods. There are apparently 330 million of them. Yep. So there's like 1 for every 3 people in India, or 1 for every 4 people in India, or whatever the maths is. But you don't have to understand who all those 330 gods are, but understanding the significance of, as I suggested, the belief in reincarnation, I think is an example of that type of sensitivity to those other cultural factors. And finally, empathy. As I said, it's important to be able to understand the way in which people communicate across cultures. In India, it's very poor form to confront someone in public, to criticise, even if that's meant as constructive, positive feedback, to deliver that to somebody in a group environment challenges them on a very deep level, and it's the kind of thing which needs to be avoided. But that ability to empathise with those other cultures, I think, is a precursor to be able to operate in those places. And as I said, lots of people fail. I think it's worth pointing out that lots of people So I know that had Serge been here, he was going to give some anecdotes about colleagues of his who've joined TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, from places such as Accenture, and they have not survived, they don't last the first year. The gap is just too extreme, and they are unable to bridge that gap. I had a friend in London who worked for Deutsche Bank as an analyst. He also took a job with a Indian company and lasted less than 6 months. It's a tough and challenging environment, not just going and living in a place like India with all of its complexity and the disparity of wealth and poverty and all that stuff which challenges you, but even working for organisations that come from places which are culturally very different, pose really big challenges for professionals. Sometimes it's just too tough and the challenges are too great. And that even manifests itself with Indians who go and work in other parts of the world. So, maybe come and spend a decade in the US, or they do their education in Europe and then go back to India and really struggle and find it too difficult for them to be able to sustain. Mark time sat in a car trying to get somewhere, and there's several million other people also trying to go in the same direction. Somebody gave me a very good piece of advice when I first moved to Mumbai, which is they said there are 3 things that you need to survive in this city. They are a good car, a good driver, and a good phone, because you're going to spend a large chunk of your time sat in that car, being driven around, trying to get your work done. So you need to make sure that those things are in place. So the frustrations that I experience are not really in the professional environment. There are some irritants that I experience, and then there are always irritants when you try and run a business, particularly a kind of services business. So people have said to me, don't you find it really difficult to get your Indian clients to pay their bills? And I say, I used to find it very difficult to get my American or my British clients to pay their bills. And the bigger they are, the worse they are at paying their bills. And in all of the 8.5 years that we've been there, we've not had a bad debt. So we've never had anything that hasn't ultimately got paid. There have been people who've stretched my patience immensely, but ultimately we've been able to achieve that. And to me, business is about building relationships. And if you go in and you build good and honest and relationships, and you build trust, and you're able to deliver. And the professional side of it, I think, actually works well. It's this kind of stuff, the fact that there's so many people, not enough space, lack of resources. There's my morning routine involves taking my 2 children to the end of our road where they get on a bus that takes them to school, much like growing up in America, really. You put them on the school bus and then go for a run. The problem that I have is that in that 200 metres that I have to walk to get to the end of the street, which is a one-way street, somebody will come down the road the wrong way, talking on their mobile phone and flashing their lights at me before I've even got halfway up the street. People will drive across red lights without any care for those people that are trying to cross the road, and a constant kind of unwillingness to queue. I think Indians think that queuing is some kind of weird thing that white people do. It's definitely not something that Indians are going to spend their time doing. It's that kind of stuff that I think becomes really draining. So, professionally, I think it's manageable. I think it's this other kind of stuff that actually becomes quite challenging. On the professional point, I think that many of the sort of larger and more ambitious Indian companies, and I'll talk about a few of them in a minute, kind of have a willingness to benchmark themselves against global best practice, a desire to be able to stand, if you like, shoulder to shoulder with their international peers. But they often don't like to pay for it. Yeah. So when I deal with Indian companies, I'm constantly being asked to sharpen my pencil. India is a very cost-conscious market, and that can be frustrating. But the other side of that is that I think it teaches you valuable lessons and forces you to rethink traditional models and find new ways of showing and delivering value. So it's not necessarily in itself a bad thing, although it can be frustrating. Allied to that cost focus, which sometimes I have to say becomes an obsession, there's also an unwillingness on the part of Indian companies, even big ones, to invest in planning and strategy. The focus is very firmly on execution and delivery, so relationships often end up being rather transactional and tactical. There is a wonderful saying that Indians use to describe themselves: we are like that only. it's a way of saying that things are not necessarily rational. The reasons for this are not necessarily rational, but that is how we are. And it provides a lens, I think, through which to understand some of the characteristics, if you will, of professional life in India. So, alongside the cost consciousness that I've described, you become aware that there are sometimes other unspoken factors at play in decision making. My experience is that, typically if I'm working in the West and I meet a client and I'm invited to deliver a proposal, ultimately they will be making a decision which is really based around some combination of cost and quality. And what I find in India is that there are often other things which are not about cost and not about quality, but are more about relationships and about how were you introduced? Who is it that you know in the organisation? What community are you from? Right? Which may have a bearing on whether or not you're successful in that commercial endeavour. And that may or may not have some kind of corrupt element to it. It's not necessarily an example of corruption, it could be, but sometimes it's about the fact that in places where there is a trust deficit, and India is definitely a place where there is a trust deficit, then it's not just about the obvious things and that people are making decisions based on a range of other factors. So I thought it would be interesting to conclude by looking at some of the work that we do as a way of, if you like, showcasing some of the opportunities for communicators. I've picked two. Actually, what I'm going to do is first tell you about Tata Consultancy Services. I've mentioned the Tata Group, which is by far India's most significant set of businesses. TCS is the biggest Indian company by market capitalisation. It is a big enterprise by anybody's standards. It's almost 50 years old. Its revenues in the third quarter of the financial year that's just ended were $4.387 billion. And of that revenue, over 90% of it comes from outside India. So this is not a company that really has a significant presence in India, but it has a massive and significant presence in markets like the US, where it now competes with companies like Accenture and IBM. It employs 375,000 employees. The majority of them are in India. The minority of them are in the markets in which it operates. It employs people from 122 nationalities and offices in 45 countries. And now Serge was going to talk more eloquently about TCS because that's the company that he spent the last 10 years working for. They are a client of ours, and they have a quite interesting connection with New York. Do you really know what that is? No? Any runners amongst you?
In just a few days, runners from all over the world will pound the pavement during the 2016 TCS New York City Marathon.
TCS is in our third year of partnership with the TCS New York City Marathon. We get more and more excited about it every year as we look to make the race the most technologically advanced and the most socially engaged race in the world.
This year we have a number of new technological elements to enhance the runner and spectator experience.
This is only the tip of the iceberg. We plan to expand on these different technological experiences in the years to come. GoIT is a program we're really excited to bring into this year's TCS New York City Marathon.
My favorite thing about GoIT is you get to be as creative as you want.
The kids from New York Road Runners Youth Programs out here running. It's a great way to be inspired.
Yep, you can run!
Marathon morning in the 5 boroughs.
There is no better reason to celebrate this great city than running the TCS New York City Marathon.
We're checking in with, she's running an average of a 7:16.
So I thought it was interesting that nobody kind of made the connection there with, you know, what is an iconic event in this city, and the fact that TCS was, you know, now the lead sponsor of that. They sponsor a number of other,
Was that your project?
no, it was not my project. The production house is based in New York. I bet they had a hell of a job getting that approved.
Oh, I think so,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a nice piece of work, but I know who the client was. I mean, I know the guy that would have been the guy that signed that off in, is a chemicals business. It is the owner of a brand called Tata Salt. With 1.3 billion people in India, you can imagine that quite a lot of salt gets used, so actually it's kind of quite a significant business. It's also, and this is also a client of ours, I'm going to show you a piece of work that we've done for Tata Chemicals. It acquired businesses in North America, in the Trona mine in a place called Green River, Wyoming. I've had the privilege to go underground in Green River, Wyoming, and meet some of the people who used to work for, I can't remember what the company was called now, United, Allied, something or other, and who got taken over by Tata Chemicals. And I went and ran focus groups and workshops and talked to people about what the implications were of changing the name above their facility. And they were like, hey, whatever, as long as the salaries get paid, that's fine. Then they bought businesses in the US. They also have a sort of business services team that's based out somewhere in Rockaway in New Jersey. I'm going to go and visit them on Friday. They've got businesses in the UK and a business in Kenya, and they've got a 75-year tradition in India. And so what they did was they acquired colleagues through these acquisitions in lots of other parts of the world, and they figured, okay, so we need to do some kind of internal communications around this. And Al and Roberta will know that that's kind of been one of my sort of areas of expertise over the years. So they invited us to kind of be part of a project there, which, as I said, involved some workshop activity of going and meeting people in those other territories and understanding for them what the implications were of being owned by the Tata Group. And Africa was very, very interesting. So the US, they were like, hey, yeah, whatever. In England, they were like, well, you know, we used to own India, as I said earlier, and we're not entirely sure about that. In Africa, they were like, this is really terrible if we put their name up above our factory. They have a big lake that they dig Trona out of. And we were like, so why would that be a big problem? They was like, well, all of the people that we've met are really great. We really like the people. We like their attitude, and we've seen the kind of CSR work that they do in India. But the problem in Africa is that the Tata name is associated with the trucks. And Tata Trucks is really not a premium brand, okay? So it's not a Volvo and it's not an Isuzu. In fact, I once said to somebody, met a guy who runs a haulage business, and he said, I love having a Tata truck, because what we do is we allocate trucks on a first come, first served basis, and nobody wants to be the last guy and get the Tata truck. Anyway, so there was kind of concern there, which was around association with that name. Anyway, what they decided to do was to send their existing in-house magazine, which is called Mantan, to people in other parts of the world. Now, even Hindi speakers would struggle to know what Mantan meant. Any Hindi speakers here? No. There's not even a single agreement amongst Hindi speakers in terms of what that means. You turn up in somewhere like Wyoming and give this to a bunch of miners and say, this is our new company magazine, and they're like, yeah, whatever. That's not really going to work. And so our job was to develop for them a new publication, which looks like that, and it's called Confluence. And the first edition had a feature on the business that I've described in Kenya, which was celebrating its centenary. You can see that what we've done is we've moved from, you know, this kind of creative look and feel that doesn't really do anything for anybody to something which has got much more of a kind of global appeal. Yeah, this was the edition that we produced after I'd been down the mine with the guys in Wyoming. The guys in Wyoming or New Jersey, or for that matter Kenya or the UK, pick that up and it feels like something that they will be comfortable with. Yeah? It has a kind of global look and feel about it. And this was the latest edition, which has got some senior IT guy from the business in India. That's the kind of work that we're doing in terms of being able to find a language, whether that's in terms of the written English or it's in terms of the sort of visual look and feel, that's going to help an Indian company present itself in a way which is going to resonate with audiences in other parts of the world. And no, I don't want you to see that bit yet. This is a piece of work that we did for Dow Chemicals. You will know Dow. They have a difficult... Huh?
Agent Orange.
Yeah, so they have a difficult relationship really around the world, which stems not only from the manufacture of Agent Orange, but for the fact that they bought a business called Union Carbide, which was associated with the Bhopal disaster, gas disaster in India. And so all of the communications that Dow does anywhere in the world is essentially seen through that lens. And they have to be very careful in terms of how they manage their communications. And all of the communications which are done in India are then, you know, signed off in Midland or wherever their headquarters is. Anyway, this is a little film that we made about one of the CSR projects that they're involved in.
वर्ल्ड में जो हवा, पानी और मिट्टी है वो हम फिर नहीं बना सकते, उन्हें अच्छे से वापरना चाहिए, उनका बचत करना चाहिए।
At Dow India, we understand that small changes make a big difference. When a student learns the importance of conservation from a teacher, that teacher influences not only the student, but the student's family and friends. It's a very effective way to multiply the message. Dow India has partnered with Trailblazers, a company which has pioneered environmental education and training in India. Together with Dow India, they're working towards scripting a future where sustainability is at the forefront of people's minds.
Our goal is to leave this planet in a better shape for the younger generation. And when we looked at Multiply the Message, it's like training the teachers who are going to train the young population.
Teachers participate in a 2-day workshop where they discover new teaching methods, making teaching about the environment more interesting and interactive.
Because a teacher teaches approximately 200 students a year. In a lifespan of a teacher's 20-25 years of career, she's reaching out to thousands of students, so the impact is phenomenal.
The workshops are fun. The teachers take the fun and new ideas back to their schools. They start to multiply the message.
मुलांना तो एक गेम ऍक्टिव्हिटी घेतली, मुलांनी ते एका मिनिटामध्ये पाणी गोळा करून आम्ही त्याचं मोजून घेतलं ते पाणी आणि आमच्या मुख्याध्यापकांना तो ग्लास नेऊन दाखवलं की रोज आपल्या शाळेचं एवढं पाणी वेस्टेज जाते. मुख्याध्यापकांनी लगेच प्लंबर बोलवून तो नळ दुरुस्त करून घेतला, म्हणजे त्याचा रिझल्ट आम्हाला लगेच मिळाला.
Be it history, be it geography, physics, chemistry, biology, there will be some sustainability issues that one can cover through an outdoor experiential learning. Outdoors always great fun.
The program is now in its 4th year. Since 2009, 650 teachers and B.Ed students have touched the lives of 130,000 students.
Investing in training is investing in the future.
Each small idea is a seed that is planted. It multiplies the message on to each person around. Multiply the Message is aligned to Dow's sustainability goals. At Dow, we believe that together, science and humanity can solve nearly everything, an approach we call solutionism.
मैं स्कूल आते वक्त कहीं पर नल चालू देखती हूँ तो बंद करती हूँ और मेरी माँ को भी मैं कहती हूँ कि अगर जितना पानी चाहिए उतना वापरना चाहिए.
We can achieve so much when we multiply the message. Together, we can write the future.
So what we find is that, you know, the sort of areas of work that we get involved in are either around big Indian companies who are creating international footprints and need some help in terms of the way in which they communicate externally, or big companies who are coming into India and again need to be careful about and make sure that the way in which they communicate is consistent and appropriate. I'm going to leave you with a story about McDonald's. Bear in mind that 50% of Indians are vegetarian, and the cow is sacred. Yeah. There's actually been a ban on beef in many states in India. When people who trade in beef risk death in some parts of the country, where vegetarianism is promoted very, very aggressively. So, you know, whereas in the US, you know, a choice to be vegetarian will be, you know, met with a kind of, yeah, fine, great, you get on with not eating meat. I mean, in India it could literally be the death of you in some states. It's easier to buy Class A drugs than beef in Mumbai, so I'm reliably told by my millennial colleagues. McDonald's success in a country where 50% of the population is vegetarian, I think is absolutely phenomenal. And it's to do with their ability to understand the market and deliver a product range to suit local taste. This is the Maharaja Mac, the chicken burger. The product range varies from state to state and region to region. So some McDonald's restaurants would be completely vegetarian. Some of them would cater to other sort of subsections of vegetarianism. So there's a community called the Jains who won't eat anything that comes from under the ground. They won't eat onion, they won't eat potatoes. But McDonald's will serve a full menu which is tailored specifically to their tastes. I had some friends who were in India 17 years ago. I know it was 17 years ago because they then came and participated in our wedding, which took place in a city in Gujarat 17 years ago. They had been travelling in the north of India, they'd been up into Nepal, they'd been up into the Himalayas, they got back down into New Delhi, and they succumbed to the Twin Arches and thought, okay, we've eaten so much, Indian food, we're going to go and we're going to eat in McDonald's. And in their brief stay in a McDonald's restaurant in New Delhi, they got talking to a young couple, local Indians. And the two local Indians that they were talking to were really surprised, but also delighted to know that in London there were also branches of McDonald's, which they thought was an Indian brand. That is how successful McDonald's has been at tailoring its product and building a brand in India. It's a measure, I think, of the success that is possible to achieve. So you'll see that there are exciting opportunities for those who have the ambition and the soft skills that we've talked about to complement the technical stuff that you will be learning at this fine institution. So that's it from me. Thank you. Dhanyabad to anybody that can speak and read Hindi. I'd be very pleased to take any questions.
Smile, don't be like my students.
Yes, Roberta. I can't name every